Hello, welcome to this professional learning. It's entitled Beyond Indicator 4, Considering Data Systems and Practices for More Effective Discipline. Hi, my name is Jim Fager. I am the Regional Behavior Consultant for the Greater Louisville Education Cooperative. We are a special education regional technical assistance center serving the Greater Louisville area. The professional learning you're about to begin is focused on how do we move past the compliance with Indicator 4, which is a special education indicator looking at or examining suspension and removal rates of students with disabilities beyond 10 days. It's grounded in federal regulation, IDEA, or special education law. And how we're going to begin is to start with a review of the data, the systems, and practices affecting equitable discipline outcomes for our students with disabilities. So we'll start this conversation with an overview of the indicator. This is going to be followed by a discussion of the paradoxical relationship between school administrator beliefs and practices of exclusionary discipline. Next, we're going to examine a model of a student code of conduct and discipline tracking that supports the idea of equitable discipline decision making. The session is going to conclude with a quick review of some resources that can inform your future planning and hopefully implementation or refinement of effective school discipline at the district, school building, or even at the teacher practice level. Successful completion, and I think meaningful benefit from this professional learning is best accomplished by engaging in the reflection activities. And you're going to see those prompted throughout the video. And by completing these guided notes that accompany the professional learning. You can follow the QR or the shortened URL on the screen to access this resource and others. While this professional learning is designed primarily for building and district level school administrators, I think educator leaders of all types would benefit from participating in this training. It'll give us an opportunity to reflect on our current disciplinary practices within the learning environments we serve. It'll give you an opportunity to proactively explore how data, systems, and practices influence systemically effective discipline. And while it's not required for you to submit a completed guided note for credit, I think it will assist you in making deeper connections to the learning and likely improve your performance on the 10-item multiple choice post test and the ELA reflections that are required for course credit. Successful completion of this professional learning will earn 2 hours of approved instructional leadership credit for Kentucky school administrators. Let's begin with a definition. Indicator 4 is one of 17 special education indicators. It's used by the federal government to measure both compliance with and effectiveness of a state, or in our case, school district's special education programming. An annual report is submitted from school districts to the State Department of Education, and in turn, each State Department of Education makes a report to the US Department of Education. Today's focus is an indicator which examines the rates of suspension of our students with disabilities beyond 10 days. It's broken into two parts. Indicator 4A explores whether the overall rate of suspension beyond 10 days of students with disabilities is disproportionately high compared to the state's rate of suspensions of students with disabilities beyond 10 days. Indicator 4B compares the rates of suspension of our students with disabilities beyond 10 days in any given race. And we're again comparing that to the state rate. According to the Kentucky Department of Education's risk assessment rubric, a school district does not have significant discrepancy by IEP status as a whole or by race or ethnicity in their rates of suspensions and expulsions beyond 10 days if the district's rates of suspension is less than 3 times that of the state rate. Essentially, data collected from Indicator 4 helps us answer this very meaningful question. Does our school district's rates of suspensions of students with disabilities as a whole or any minority subgroup differ from the other school districts in the state? And are there systemic factors contributing to the difference? Again, when a school district's rates of suspension are 3 times that or more of the state rates, then it's significantly disproportionate. It's out of compliance. I want to take a moment to compare two indices that have a lot in common, and sometimes they get conflated. Indicator 4 and significant disproportionality. The terms sound very similar, and they hold in common this idea that neither a student's race nor the presence of a disability should reliably predict suspensions beyond 10 days. According to the IDEA Technical Assistance Center, disproportionality is most commonly thought of as a district level phenomenon, with the primary question being, are children from one racial or ethnic group treated differently from children in other racial ethnic groups in a particular school district? I think we'd all agree we'd like that answer to be no. So how do we know if it's yes or no? Well, we have to look at the data. We have to support our assumptions with facts. Significant disproportionality is not a calculation. It's actually a determination. It's focused on risk, and it's guided by several factors, including calculations. In general, risk tells us how likely a particular outcome is. It's important for educators in general, but particularly for educator leaders. We have to be able to answer this question. Does a student with disabilities race or ethnicity represent an unreasonably predictive risk for suspensions that exceed 10 days within my school or within my district? And central to the determination are data that examine the risk of suspensions within each racial group. Then, comparing each racial group's individual risk of suspension to all the other students' racial groups combined, that's where we get our understanding of significant disproportionality. Now, the math may be a bit confusing for some of us who are not real math people, but I think the concept is quite clear. A student with disabilities race should not predict their risk for receiving long-term suspensions. Well, I might get a little academic on you here for just a minute. You might be wondering why 10 days? Well, if you're not one to geek out on just random facts, you can feel free to forward beyond right to the next slide. But for those of us who like these little context clues or whatever, over 40 years ago, the US Supreme Court set that standard that removing a student for disciplinary purposes beyond 10 days is the same as changing that student's educational placement. A really interesting case that the Supreme Court decided on is Honig versus Doe. You can check that out in your own research and time. It's not that a student's educational placement can't be changed. It's that placement changes cannot solely be decided by school authorities, except under extreme circumstances, when unilateral removals are permitted. But even under those extreme circumstances, it's not for more than 45 days. But that's another professional learning. This is a quote I'm going to share with you in just a moment from an exceptional children's magazine. I think it's apropos. The quote dates back to a journal article from 2008, but sadly, the concern resonates today. And it reads, "The disproportionate representation of minority children is among the most critical and enduring problems in the field of special education." You see, it's not just about the formal removals like suspensions and expulsions, because anytime a kid is or a student is removed from their learning environment for disciplinary purposes, it's a removal from instruction. And as our Associate Commissioner for Special Education, Dr. Greta Hilton, is apt or known for saying, a removal is a removal is a removal. You see, removals are broader than suspensions, and they can be informally implied but have the same impact as formal removals. And while a removal isn't defined necessarily in IDEA and regulations, informal removals have impact upon our students with disabilities. You see, they are actions that are taken by school personnel in response to a child's behavior that excludes them for part or all of the school day. And these informal removals include administrative shortened days, these decisions that are made outside of an admissions and release committee meeting. Now, a change of placement, as I mentioned, includes the disciplinary removal of a student for more than 10 consecutive school days. And if this is going to take place, the district is required to notify the parents of this impending placement and again, provide them with procedural safeguard notices. Generally speaking, removing a student from their learning environment for disciplinary purposes is generally considered a removal unless three factors are met. Number one, even while they're receiving this disciplinary removal, that student with disability continues to have an opportunity to participate in the general education curriculum. Secondly, that student continues to receive services that are specified on their individualized education program. And thirdly, that student, while experiencing this disciplinary removal, is able to participate with non-disabled children to the extent they would have in their current placement. That's a very high bar. The French philosopher Voltaire wrote, "Every individual is a creature of the age in which they live, and few are able to raise themselves above the ideas of their time." I think that quote has application to this conversation. You see, equitable discipline will not happen just by itself. It has to be framed pedagogically. And equitable discipline has to be envisioned and then planned for. And as an educator leader, this begins by us, I guess, individually acknowledging that our own views on discipline are shaped by the prevailing attitudes of our time. They're shaped by our experiences, they're shaped by our professional judgment, our learning, our predilections, and so on. Acknowledging these biases, if you will, these framing heuristics, if you'd like to call them that, I think will help set the stage and position us to critically assess our disciplinary practices and systems and the data with which we choose to evaluate them. And so we want to bridge paradigm into practice. So where does that take place? Well, you might think about indicator 4 as the vector by which we measure equitable discipline practices for our students with IEPs. So the assumption is simple. Again, the presence of a disability and the color of a student's skin should not be predictors of suspension. So why is it so often the case? Well, I think that's a complicated question, and I don't want to oversimplify a complicated matter, but I think it's something we need to lean into. And I believe this slide might provide some insight. Racetracks, as an example, have staggered starting positions for runners. You can see that on both the left and extreme right side images on your screen, right? They have staggered starting positions for runners to ensure that all athletes run the same distance, as the outer lanes are longer than the inner lanes, and that's due to the curvature of the track. By starting further ahead on the outside lanes, runners effectively cover the same distance as those in the inside lanes when they reach the finish line. So what looks fair, look at the image at the middle of our screen, isn't really fair at all. The same can be said for factors beyond a student's control, such as the presence of a disability or the color of a child's skin. Neither of these factors should be determinants for removals. Again, I think there's a pedagogical responsibility to understand the impact that race may be having on our disciplinary decisions, to understand the impact that a student's disability has upon behavior or our disciplinary decisions, but they should never be defining factors. A well-planned IEP is like the outside lane at a starting point in a race. At superficial glance, or individuals who are uninformed or may not be aware of really the depth and breadth of what an IEP does, it might appear to be an advantage. But when an IEP is developed and viewed properly, it's really about creating equal opportunities. Partnering with the RAND Corporation, the Brookings Institute conducted a survey of 1,080 school principals across the United States. Its study took place in the fall of 2021 using RAND's nationally representative American School Leader Panel. And the results of this poll were interesting. Most principals, about 82% of them, agreed or strongly agreed that the primary purpose of discipline is to teach appropriate skills to students who misbehave. You see, principals by and large do not believe exclusionary discipline achieves this goal. Only 13% of principals agree that suspensions and expulsions reduce misbehavior. So, if the vast majority of principals don't believe in zero tolerance practices, why are they so prevalent? Why do they persist? This is the first formal opportunity I want you to take to pause the video and reflect. Get a hold of your guided note and turn your attention to the number 2, the second section there. You're going to find 2 reflection questions. First, why do you think there's a disconnect between beliefs and practices? Perhaps individuals who are engaging in zero tolerance approaches or overly relying on removals who don't believe in it. Why do you think there's a disconnect about the display, about these practices? And secondly, how do you or can you promote supportive or instructional discipline in your school or in your district? Again, pause the video, complete the reflections, and then you can resume. Well, the Brookings Institute offered 3 possibilities. I try to distill them for you here in the slide using an alliteration. I like them. They help me remember things. Essentially, the Brookings Institute says it suggests policies, personnel, and paradigms may be impacting this disconnect. First, zero tolerance policies may limit principals' options. It's possible our school leadership feels compelled by policies to suspend students more often than they would like to do so. Secondly, personnel factors can play a role here. As one former teacher pointed out, high suspending schools may be insufficiently resourced to adopt non-punitive or alternatives to suspensions. So, for example, effectively implementing a restorative justice program or, say, some other restorative practice, this often requires significant school resources, including more time and engagement from teachers and counselors relative to the exclusionary practices that may be prevalent and are much more expeditious. Third, it could be that exclusionary practices remain prevalent simply because they're what educators and educator leaders are accustomed to do. They believe in it, despite the overwhelming evidence to suggest the contrary. You see, zero tolerance policies had their peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It was in the wake of a series of high-profile school shootings that took place across the United States. And then there was federal legislation that had a byword associated with it, and it's one we can all stand by, that schools should have zero tolerance for guns on their campuses. I think everybody can agree with that. But zero tolerance became a buzzword that infused its way into student code of conduct books. And the assumption is pretty straightforward, and it seems at face value to be, reasonable. The idea is that we were going to have a uniform response to a violation of a code of conduct that's harsh, it's swift. We're going to treat any violation the same. And the idea is students will then be deterred from engaging in those behaviors in the future. And then, secondly, by engaging in these zero tolerance practices, it'll send a deterring message to other students. While, as H.L. Mencken aptly said, for every problem, there's a solution that's simple and clear and wrong. In fact, we know it's wrong because the APA in 2006 conducted a comprehensive study, a sweeping analysis that examined the effectiveness of zero tolerance policies in America's K-12 schools. And what they found was profound. Zero tolerance policies have zero positive effect on student behavior, on school safety, on school climate. In fact, zero tolerance policies have a negative, a deleterious effect upon these metrics. And these negative effects are not equally distributed. It creates greater risk and greater adverse resolutions for our students of color and students with IEPs. No educator leader would pedagogically and knowingly agree to have in place frameworks that we know have disproportionate impacts upon our students. It's irresponsible. So, this notion that paradigms persist, I think we'd all agree that they're not healthy. And change in paradigm, as we can all attest, can be frustratingly slow. I want us to pause the video one more time here, or the next time here. I want you to go back to the guided note. Thinking about your own district policies, thinking about your own practices in your school. Can you identify any that adversely or just unnecessarily affect student behavior? If so, what is that policy and how, or practice, and how could it be improved to support better outcomes for all students, but particularly our students with disabilities? Engaging our stakeholders in conversations about student discipline policies, student discipline practices, and what we hope to happen from them, it can be very challenging and for some of us, even intimidating. We all want conversations like these to be productive. And while potentially challenging and a little scary, conversations like these set the stage for more effective student discipline. So they must be had. So thinking about that, these barriers, these challenges to productive conversations, what are some that you could anticipate that you might experience? What are some barriers or challenges to productive conversations that address equitable discipline practices? Again, turn your attention in the guided note to section 4, productive conversations. When you've completed the prompt, you can return to the video. So I promised an example. Fayette County Public Schools serves the Lexington, Kentucky metropolitan area. It has nearly 42,000 students in its PK through 12 learning environments and is Kentucky's second largest school district. The student body is comprised of approximately 42% white students, and Black students make up the second largest group, about 23% of the student population. There are other significant groups, including Hispanic or Latino students and Asian students and others. Now, historically, Fayette County Public Schools struggled with its student outcome metrics, including disproportionality. But the leadership at Fayette County Public Schools conducted what I like to call or coin as a fearless moral inventory, if you will. They looked at their internal practices, they looked at their internal policies and systems, and they made sweeping systemic change that has been implemented over the past few years. And as you can see on the screen here, those changes have resulted in extraordinarily positive results for their students. And while these changes were complex, I think the paradigm shift is what I really want to focus on. The paradigm that Fayette County Public Schools has prioritized in their approach to student discipline is as noteworthy as it is successful. So let me show you an example of it. This is an excerpt from the 2025-2026 Fayette County Public Schools Code of Conduct Student Guide. And supporting the idea that administrators can do practical things to shift from theory to practice is, I think, providing this concrete example of when we are working with a student who is completed or conducted some sort of a violation of the code of conduct, our disciplinary responses that we choose can set the stage for whether or not that behavior persists, or we can address underlying skills that are missing, or perhaps the student has those skills but doesn't see the need to follow them. So there's efficacy, relationship, or belonging issues at play. And if you take a look here at the screen, you can see that the response options for school administrators are organized in preferred order. And you can see at the top left, there are what our Fayette County Public Schools call supportive options. And then on the right, traditional options. And the idea is Fayette County would like for our school administrators to prioritize or at minimum pair supportive responses with those traditional responses. And I think the reasoning can be understood from this excerpt that I've pulled out of the guidebook here. And it reads, to ensure that all students demonstrate growth and achievement, we must take timely, deliberate, and unified action to eliminate exclusionary practices and address historical and social barriers that prevent our students from reaching their highest potential. Thinking about Fayette County Public Schools Code of Conduct Matrix, what's the difference between the two resolution options? Again, pause the video, reflect on that. Reflect on the idea about the paradigm. What do you suppose the discipline paradigm that Fayette County Public Schools has prioritized? How would you describe it? Once you've finished with that reflection, you can resume the video. Blood pressure cuffs, thermometers, and those little things they stick on the end of your finger to measure your oxygen, those oximeters or whatever they're called. These are a few of the instruments that our healthcare providers use to gather data, and those data guide their patient care. They guide how they take care of us. And when and how these instruments are used is governed by lots of things, right? There's at minimum law, regulation. There's also best practice guidance that's grounded in health science. That's an ever-growing body of literature. And that's all put together under the clinician's professional judgment. How silly would it be to see these tools in a morgue, right? And similar to healthcare, special education is governed by regulations. It's grounded in science, and it's a body of literature that increases and grows every year. We have tools such as functional behavior assessments that, when produced properly, lead to very effective behavior intervention plans and decision-making procedures that guide our professional judgment. We need these, particularly when we're looking at student behavior, when we're trying to determine the origin of and the best response to any behavior of concern. As an example, manifestation determination reviews. Oh, they're timely, they can be exhausting, they can be stressful. But if they're done properly, actually to the spirit in which they were framed, I think they could be very helpful processes. You see, manifestation determination reviews are a good example of a procedural requirement that is intended to prevent the disproportionate application of exclusionary discipline. But more often than not, it's seen as a compliance, paperwork, and procedural event. You see, manifestation determination reviews essentially compel us as school administrators to consider the relationship between a student's disability and a behavior that's subject to a disciplinary removal. It compels us to think about the sufficiency and the integrity of the student's educational programming. We have it in paper, or are we actually doing it? However, where data indicates that there is disproportionality, oftentimes upon close examination, we see manifestation determination reviews are done after the fact. They're rarely used preventatively. In fact, they're often viewed what we call post-mortem, when they should be viewed preventatively. They should be used to guide instructional discipline. So I've included as an example on the screen here is one way that you can keep track of students with disabilities who engage in repetitive behaviors that result in potential removals from instruction. So, what else can I do as an educator leader? Well, I think it's incumbent upon us to engage in professional learning that builds our data literacy, builds our functional understanding of how to apply the data that we have and make action plans through them, through, say, student information management systems like Infinite Campus and Tableau or other data dashboards. By becoming literate and incorporating their examination regularly into our school or district leadership team meetings and making actionable plans from them, I think we can go a long way in reducing the disproportionate removal of our students with disabilities. You see, these data analyses will compel then IEP reviews, IEP revisions, making sure that the instructional integrity is there, making sure that the appropriate specially designed instruction is identified and delivered. Most would agree that as a general rule of thumb, it's better to be proactive than reactive. It's much better to prevent a problem behavior than simply prepare or respond to it. But shifting thinking towards a preventative mindset can be challenging, and in fact, it can be intimidating. And continuing with our reflections, I want you to turn your attention back to the guided note to section 5, and you're going to find two prompts. First, what support do administrators, teachers, and staff currently receive that you can identify that will enable you to engage in proactive adoption of processes, of practices that keep our students in classrooms engaged in the general ed curriculum? And in that same line of thought, what practices would you like to see in place? Would you like to see revised, supported, or removed, maybe, that will enable all of our students to succeed? Again, pause the video, take time to reflect, and then you can resume your learning. This is all well and good, Jim. I appreciate it, but I don't have time. It's an oft-given a response. And I understand that nobody measures time closer than an educator. Nobody measures time closer than an educator leader. I cannot think of any other profession that I can ask that individual on a work day, where are you? Typically at 8:37, at 2:11, at 9:14 a.m. Educators can tell you within a minute what they're doing because minutes matter. So please don't hear me minimize, but sometimes I don't have time is a response that might not be well informed. Is it factual? Within your resource folder is an article that I think you might find interesting. It's entitled Evaluating Time Saved as an Index of Cost Effectiveness Within PBIS Schools. The article provides a comparative analysis of time lost from instruction between schools that implement reactive discipline versus schools implementing positive discipline. You can follow the QR on the screen or you can go through the flyer, but take a moment now and pause the video. Read that article. It'll take you about 10 minutes. And then once you're finished, reflect on it. How can this resource be used to support buy-in in the learning environments that I supervise within the administrators that I support? Over the next couple of slides, we're going to wrap up our professional learning by sharing some resources with you that I hope that you'll reference after today. I've organized them into two broad groups, equipping administrators, and then you'll see here in just a moment some resources to equip our teaching staff. Okay. First, on the left, you'll see this document entitled Guiding Principles for Creating Safe, Inclusive, Supportive, and Fair School Climates. That's a pretty lengthy title. I suppose the authors distilled it down to what they thought was the most important facets, and moving one of those would be less than having kept it. So be mindful of what I think they're trying to address here. And essentially, this resource identifies 5 guiding principles and suggests actions that schools and school districts can take to create learning environments that are inclusive, that create learning environments that are safe and the students feel supportive and they're given fair learning opportunities. To the right is a document published by the US Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services. It's designed as a companion guide to the DOE's Q&A document addressing the needs of children with disabilities and IDEA's discipline provisions, which is available for download at ed.gov. The three resources pictured on the slide here are geared toward our classroom teachers, and they provide practical guidance for teachers to understand and apply evidence-based practices that will prevent and effectively respond to student behaviors of concern. I think any one of these resources can be one that you can select as a building level administrator or as a district level administrator for continued professional learning within professional learning communities, supervisory and mentoring kind of relationships, and so on. Again, these resources are available to you through the QR and bit.ly that I shared at the beginning, and it's also on this professional learning flyer. Well, change takes time, and time in and of itself does not ensure change. And as the Brookings Institute study revealed, poor practices persist for a variety of reasons, not short of which is educator leaders like all of us, we don't know what we don't know. And I'm sure you're familiar with the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Well, what you might not be familiar with is the farmer's response. Yeah, that's true, but I can salt the hay. And as an educator leader, we may not be able to directly affect change on a system, but we can salt the hay. We can create context that supports change, that enables change. We can identify what's key for influencing continuous improvement. And I can identify for you a couple of things right out of the gate. Regularly reviewing your data, making reflections on that data, and encouraging practice revisions that support equitable disciplinary outcomes through plan, do, study, act cycles. Be a very simple shift in practice that we can engage in. All right, this concludes our professional learning. Please return your attention to the flyer to access a link to the 10-item multiple choice post test. Successful completion of the post test is defined as achieving a minimum of 8 correct items out of the 10 offered. Thank you for your time and attention. Please take a look at other professional learning offerings from the Greater Louisville Education Cooperative. And if you have any questions about this professional learning, feel free to reach out to me by way of my Jefferson County email. It's james.fager@jefferson, or by reaching out to the Greater Louisville Education Cooperative. Thank you.